Sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, catching the dust motes dancing in the air. It was my birthday, and I'd woken up with a flutter of anticipation. Galen had promised to bring Miss over for lunch, a small celebration, just the three of us. "It'll be lovely, Mom," Miss had said on the phone yesterday. "Just a quiet family affair." I hummed a little tune as I arranged the yellow roses. Galen had sent a sweet gesture, even if I suspected Miss had reminded him. He was a good boy, Galen. A little too focused on his career perhaps, but devoted to Miss. I smoothed down the tablecloth, a crisp linen one my late husband, Arthur, had always loved. He would have been 72 today, too. A pang of sadness echoed through me, a familiar ache. I glanced at his photo on the mantelpiece. "We'll celebrate together in spirit, my love," I whispered, tracing the outline of his smiling face. I'd made his favorite lemon drizzle cake, the one with the tangy glaze he couldn't resist. The aroma filled the kitchen, a comforting blanket against the chill of the October air. I checked the roast in the oven, basting it with the juices that had collected in the pan. Everything was perfect, or so I thought. The phone rang, shattering the quiet hum of the afternoon. "Hello," I answered, already picturing Miss and Galen's faces as they walked through the door. "Mom, it's Miss." My daughter's voice came through, strained and hesitant. We can't make it today." My smile faltered. "Oh, darling, what happened?" I asked, a knot of disappointment forming in my stomach. "Is everything all right?" There was a pause, a shuffling sound on the other end of the line. "Galen has a sudden client meeting," Miss finally said. "It's unavoidable. We're so sorry." My disappointment deepened. On my birthday, I couldn't help the slight tremor in my voice. "I made your father's lemon drizzle cake." "I know, Mom," Miss replied, her voice tight. "We really are sorry. We'll make it up to you, I promise." I could hear Galen murmuring something in the background, too low for me to decipher. "He says happy birthday," Miss relayed. "He'll call you later." "All right, dear," I managed, trying to sound cheerful despite the sinking feeling in my chest. "Give him my best." We exchanged hurried goodbyes, and I hung up the phone. The silence of the house suddenly heavy and oppressive. I stared at the perfectly set table, the three places laid out, a stark reminder of their absence. A knock at the door startled me. Perhaps they'd changed their minds. Perhaps Galen had finished his meeting early. A surge of hope propelled me to the door. I flung it open, a welcoming smile plastered on my face. But the faces that greeted me weren't the ones I expected. Standing on my porch were Roth and Celine, Galen's parents, their expressions a strange mixture of awkwardness and something else, something that looked suspiciously like triumph. "Celine Roth," I stammered, my smile fading. "What are you doing here?" "Veralda," Roth began, clearing his throat. He held a thick envelope in his hand. "We need to talk about the house." My heart lurched. "The house? What about the house? What is there to talk about?" I asked, my voice trembling. Celine stepped forward, her voice laced with a false sympathy that made my stomach churn. "Veralda, dear," she said, placing a hand on my arm, a gesture I instinctively recoiled from. "We know this is difficult, but it's best to get this over with quickly." Roth handed me the envelope. "We've filed the necessary paperwork," he said, his tone brisk and businesslike. "The house is legally ours now." My breath caught in my throat. I stared at the envelope, unable to comprehend the words he'd just spoken. "Yours," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "But this is my house. Arthur left it to me." Celine sighed dramatically. "Oh, Veralda," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "You really should have read the fine print. The updated will clearly states that the property transfers to Galen and miss upon your incapacitation." Incapacitation, I repeated, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. "I'm not incapacitated." Roth gave a tight smile. "Perhaps not in the strictest medical sense," he conceded. "But let's be honest, Veralda, you're not exactly all there anymore, are you? After Arthur's passing, well, let's just say you haven't been yourself." He gestured towards the house. "This place is too much for you to handle. It's better off in our hands. We'll take good care of it." The blood drained from my face. I stared at them, speechless, the weight of their betrayal crushing me. They were stealing my house, my home, the place where I'd built my life with Arthur. And Miss, my own daughter, was complicit in this. The carefully arranged flowers on the table, the aroma of the lemon drizzle cake, the photo of Arthur on the mantelpiece, it all felt like a cruel mockery now. The tears welled up in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I would not give them the satisfaction. I would not break down in front of these vultures. I straightened my back, meeting Roth's smug gaze with a steely resolve I didn't know I possessed. "Get off my property," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. Veralda, Roth started, but I cut him off. I said, "Get off my property." Now, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. He glanced at Celine, who looked equally taken aback by my sudden shift in demeanor. They exchanged a quick, worried look before turning and walking back down the path, their earlier triumph replaced by palpable unease. I closed the door behind them, leaning against the cool wood, the fight only just beginning. They had underestimated me. They thought I was a grieving widow, easily manipulated, easily dismissed. They had no idea what I was capable of. They had no idea about the trust. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across my living room floor, a cruel mockery of the warmth I'd expected today. My birthday. My phone buzzed, a text from Miss. "So sorry, Mom. Galen and I can't make it today. Something came up. Something always came up. This time, it was apparently more important than celebrating my first birthday without Richard." I stared at the half-deflated balloons, the untouched cake, the two empty places set at the table. Richard would have been furious. He always cherished family traditions, birthdays most of all. He would have been singing off-key, a goofy grin plastered on his face, making everyone laugh. He would have been here. A wave of nausea washed over me. I sank into Richard's favorite armchair, the worn leather cool against my skin. The silence in the house was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. It was a gift from Richard's parents, a piece they'd always coveted. They'd hinted heavily over the years that it should return to the family fold. Richard had just laughed and said, "It's ours now, Mom, part of our home." He'd winked at me then, a mischievous glint in his eye. Suddenly, the ticking sounded less like a comforting rhythm and more like a warning. A car pulled up outside. I glanced through the window and saw a familiar sedan. My heart sank. Roth and Celine, what were they doing here? I hadn't invited them. They hadn't even called to wish me a happy birthday. I opened the door, forcing a smile. Roth, Celine, I greeted them, my voice wavering slightly. This is a surprise. Celine, never one to mince words, pushed past me into the house. Veralda, dear, she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, we need to talk. Roth followed her inside, his expression grim. He closed the door behind him, a finality to the action that sent a chill down my spine. What is it? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I had a terrible premonition, a knot tightening in my stomach. Celine patted my hand condescendingly. We're so sorry about Richard, she began, her voice laced with something that sounded suspiciously like satisfaction. But we're here to help. Help, I repeated, the word catching in my throat. With what? Roth cleared his throat. Well, Veralda, he said, his tone uncharacteristically gentle, we know this is a difficult time for you. And with Miss and Galen needing a larger place, he trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. Needing a larger place. My voice rose in disbelief. What are you talking about? Celine sighed dramatically. Darling, the house. It's far too big for you to manage on your own. And with Miss and Galen expecting, she paused, as if waiting for me to grasp the unspoken message. My blood ran cold. Expecting, I echoed, my mind reeling. They haven't told me anything about expecting. Celine waved a dismissive hand. Oh, it's early days yet. But they need this house, Veralda. It's part of the family legacy. And frankly, she added, her voice hardening, it's rightfully ours. Ours, I managed to stammer out, my legs suddenly weak. I clutched the back of Richard's armchair for support. This house is mine. Richard left it to me. Roth stepped forward, his face set in a determined expression. Actually, Veralda, he said, pulling a folded document from his pocket. There seems to be some confusion about that. We've spoken to our lawyers, and it appears the deed is in Mrs. name. I stared at the document in his hand, my mind racing. This couldn't be happening. Richard would never have done this. You don't understand, I whispered, my voice trembling. Celine placed a comforting hand on my arm, her touch like ice. We know, dear. It's all so complicated, but we'll take care of everything. You can stay with us, of course, until we find a suitable arrangement. Suitable arrangement. Their words echoed in my ears, a cruel mockery of kindness. They were kicking me out of my own home, the home Richard and I had built together, on my birthday. My vision blurred, and I felt a surge of anger, hot and fierce, rising within me. They thought they could just walk in here, on my birthday, and take my house. They thought I was some helpless widow they could push around. I looked from Celine to Roth, my gaze hardening. Get out, I said, my voice low and steady. They blinked, surprised by my sudden shift in demeanor. Veralda, Roth began, his tone conciliatory. We're just trying to get out. I repeated, my voice gaining strength. Get out of my house. Celine's lips tightened into a thin line. Don't be ridiculous, Veralda. This house belongs to Miss now. We're simply get out. I pointed towards the door, my hand trembling but my resolve unwavering. They exchanged uneasy glances. Then, without another word, they turned and left. I watched them go, my heart pounding in my chest. The silence that followed their departure was heavy, charged with a strange mix of grief and a burgeoning sense of purpose. They thought they'd won. They thought they'd taken everything from me, but they hadn't. Richard had always been a shrewd man. He'd taught me a thing or two about protecting what was ours, and I had a feeling he'd left me a birthday present they hadn't anticipated. I walked over to the bookshelf, my fingers trailing over the spines of Richard's favorite law books. He'd always been fascinated by trusts and estates, spending hours poring over complex legal documents. He'd once mentioned something about an occupancy trust, a way to protect a property from unforeseen circumstances. I pulled out a thick, leather-bound volume and began to read. The afternoon light faded, replaced by the warm glow of the table lamp, and as I turned the pages, a small, almost imperceptible smile played on my lips. Rain lashed against the windows, mirroring the storm raging inside me. Just hours ago, the silence of my empty house had been a dull ache, a reminder of Miss and Galen's absence on my birthday. Now that silence had been shattered, replaced by something far worse. Roth and Celine, Galen's parents, sat on my porch swing as if they owned the place. "Veralda, dear," Celine began, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "We know this is difficult, but we need to talk about the house." My breath hitched. How dare they? How dare they come here, after what Miss and Galen had done, and act like they had any right to even breathe the air on my property? The house, I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. Roth cleared his throat, his gaze fixed on the rose bushes my late husband Thomas had so lovingly tended. "Yes, well," with Thomas gone he trailed off, as if the mere mention of his name pained him. "Miss and Galen feel it's best if they take over the responsibility." My legs felt weak, my knees threatening to buckle. They felt it was best. As if this house, filled with decades of memories, was some unwanted burden to be shuffled off to the highest bidder. Responsibility, I echoed, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. Celine patted my hand, her touch like ice. "We understand you're grieving, dear, but this large house is too much for one person. It's better for everyone if Miss and Galen move in. They're a young family starting out." Her words trailed off, but the implication hung heavy in the air. They thought I was a fragile old woman, easily dismissed and manipulated. My heart pounded against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I clutched the porch railing, the rough wood grounding me in the face of their callous disregard. "This is my home," I stated, my voice stronger than I expected. Celine sighed dramatically. "Veralda, you're being unreasonable. Think of Miss. Think of your grandson." My grandson. They dared to use him as leverage. My vision blurred with unshed tears. I thought of Miss, my own flesh and blood, the child I had cradled in my arms, the girl I had poured my heart and soul into raising, and now she was conspiring with her in-laws to steal my home, the very foundation of my life. Rock shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting towards the street. "We've already spoken to the estate agent," he mumbled, avoiding my gaze. "The paperwork is almost finalized." The estate agent. They had gone behind my back, making arrangements without my consent, treating me as if I were already gone. A wave of nausea washed over me. This couldn't be happening. This was a nightmare. I wanted to scream, to rage, to tear at them with my bare hands. But something held me back. A flicker of resolve, a spark of defiance ignited within the ashes of my despair. I wouldn't let them see me break. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction. I see, I said quietly, my voice deceptively calm. Celine smiled, a triumphant glint in her eyes. Good. We knew you'd be sensible about this. Sensible. They thought I would meekly surrender my home, my sanctuary, the last tangible connection to my husband. They had underestimated me. They had gravely underestimated me. I took a deep breath, composing myself. I appreciate your concern, I said, my voice steady now. However, there are some legal matters that need to be clarified before any decisions are made about this house. Roth frowned. Legal matters? What legal matters? I offered a small, enigmatic smile. Let's just say, Thomas was a very meticulous man. He always planned for the future. Their smiles faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. The rain continued to fall, washing away the dust of their assumptions, revealing the steel beneath my grief. They had come here to claim my home, to strip me bare of my memories and my dignity. They had come here expecting a broken woman. They were about to find out how wrong they were. The air crackled with unspoken tension. The game was on. Night had fallen, casting long shadows across my living room. Just hours ago, Miss and Galen, my own daughter and son-in-law, hadn't even bothered to call on my birthday. Now, their absence felt like a gaping wound, a betrayal sharper than any knife. I moved through the house, each step heavy with the weight of their deception. My hand trembled as I reached for the antique chest nestled beneath the window seat, its brass hinges catching the dim light from the street lamp outside. This chest, a gift from my late husband, held more than just trinkets and keepsakes. It held the key to my future, a future I had meticulously planned for. I lifted the heavy lid, the scent of cedar and old paper filling the air. Inside, beneath layers of silk scarves and embroidered linens, lay a thick envelope. My fingers traced the embossed lettering Occupancy Trust. These documents, drafted years ago, were my insurance policy, a safeguard against unforeseen circumstances. I never imagined I'd need them against my own flesh and blood. I spread the documents across the dining table, the legal jargon swimming before my eyes. To Veralda, my beloved wife, for her comfort and security, my husband's words, written in his strong, familiar hand, echoed in my mind. He had foreseen the possibility of my vulnerability, the chance that others might try to take advantage after he was gone. He had been a wise man. He always was. I whispered to the empty room. I ran my fingers over his signature, a wave of grief washing over me. But grief was a luxury I couldn't afford. I had a battle to fight. I spent the next few hours poring over the trust documents, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and resolve. The terms were clear. The house was mine as long as I occupied it. A simple clause, yet one that held immense power. My daughter and her husband, blinded by their greed, had assumed ownership after my husband's passing. They hadn't even considered the possibility of such a trust. They'd thought I was just a grieving widow, easy to manipulate, easy to dismiss. We'll take care of everything, Mother, Miss had said, her voice dripping with false concern. You deserve some peace. Peace. They had robbed me of my peace the moment they decided my home was theirs for the taking. I carefully folded the documents, tucking them into a leather satchel. The weight of them against my side felt reassuring, a tangible symbol of my strength. The house was mine. I would not be moved. The first rays of dawn peeked through the curtains, painting the room in a soft, golden light. It was a new day, and I was ready. I had a plan. It was a long shot, a gamble, but it was the only card I had left to play. I needed help. Someone outside the tangled web of family betrayal. Someone discreet. Someone trustworthy. My mind raced, searching for a name, a face. Then I remembered Mrs. Henderson, my late husband's former legal secretary. She was sharp, efficient, and fiercely loyal. If anyone could help me navigate this legal minefield, it was her. I dressed quickly, a sense of purpose coursing through me. I had been passive for too long, allowing my grief and their manipulations to dictate my actions. No more. I grabbed my phone and dialed Mrs. Henderson's number. It rang 3 times before she answered, her voice crisp and alert. Veralda, is everything all right? Not exactly, I replied, my voice trembling slightly. I need your help. It's about the house. There was a pause on the other end, a pregnant silence. Then Mrs. Henderson's voice, firm and reassuring, filled my ear. Tell me everything. And so I did. I poured out the whole sordid story. The birthday snub, the overheard conversation, the discovery of their plot, the trust documents, everything. By the time I finished, the sun had fully risen, casting a warm glow across my living room. Don't worry, Veralda, Mrs. Henderson said, her voice calm and collected. We'll fight this. We'll make sure they understand they can't just walk all over you. Her words were like a balm to my wounded spirit. I wasn't alone. I had an ally. Meet me at my office this afternoon, she instructed. We'll go over the documents and map out a strategy. I agreed, a flicker of hope igniting within me. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The house was mine, and I would fight tooth and nail to keep it. I looked around my living room, at the familiar furniture, the family portraits, the memories that clung to every corner. This wasn't just a house. It was my home, my sanctuary, and I wouldn't let them steal it from me. I had a plan, a glimmer of hope, and the unwavering resolve of a mother wronged. They had underestimated me. They had mistaken my grief for weakness. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. This fight had just begun, and I, Veralda, was ready for war. There was a quiet strength simmering beneath the surface, a strength born of betrayal and fueled by the unshakable love for the home my husband and I had built together. The fight for my house, for my dignity, was far from over. Rain lashed against the windows, mirroring the storm inside me. Just yesterday, the silence of an empty house had been my only companion. Now, 2 figures huddled on my porch, oblivious to the downpour. It was Roth and Celine, Galen's parents. I watched them from the window, a knot tightening in my stomach. They were talking animatedly, gesturing towards my garden, towards my home. What were they doing here? The thought pricked at me. sliver of unease turning into a full-blown panic. I grabbed my cardigan, a sudden chill settling over me despite the stifling summer humidity. As I opened the door, their conversation abruptly ceased. Roth, his face flushed, turned to me with a forced smile. "Veralda, fancy seeing you here. Fancy seeing me here, in my own home." The sheer audacity of it almost choked me. "Roth," I managed, my voice trembling slightly. "Celine, what are you doing here?" Celine patted her perfectly coiffed hair, a condescending smile playing on her lips. "We're just admiring the property, dear. Such a lovely house." She glanced at Roth, a conspiratorial glint in her eyes. "Such a shame it's going to waste." My heart pounded in my chest. "Going to waste," I echoed, my grip tightening on the doorknob. "What do you mean?" Roth cleared his throat, shifting his weight uncomfortably. "Well, Veralda, you know, with you rattling around in this big place all alone," he trailed off, looking at Celine as if for guidance. She stepped in, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "It's just too much for one person, dear. So much upkeep, so many memories." Her eyes swept over the house, possessiveness barely veiled. "It's time for a fresh start. Wouldn't you say a fresh start?" My voice cracked. "This is my home." "Was your home, dear," Celine corrected, her smile widening. "Miss and Galen told us you've decided to downsize. In fact, they've already made arrangements for the sale. We're just here to meet the realtor." The blood drained from my face. Miss Galenthe'd actually gone through with it. They'd used my grief, my vulnerability, to steal my home, the house my husband and I had built together, brick by painstaking brick. The garden we had nurtured, the porch swing where we'd spent countless evenings, the memories that clung to every corner. They were trying to take it all away from me. "To haven't agreed to sell," I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. Roth chuckled, a condescending sound that grated on my nerves. "Come now, Veralda, don't be difficult. It's for the best. You'll be much happier in a smaller place, something more manageable." "Manageable," I repeated, the word laced with disbelief. My eyes darted between Roth and Celine, searching for a flicker of remorse, a hint of understanding. But there was nothing but smug satisfaction in their faces. They were reveling in their perceived victory, their callous disregard for my feelings. Celine stepped forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Besides, dear, Miss and Galen need this house. They're starting a family, you know. They need the space." The irony was almost unbearable. They were using the pretense of family to justify their betrayal. They were tearing my family apart to build their own. The rain continued to fall, the drops blurring my vision. I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me, my legs threatening to give way. "To need a moment," I mumbled, turning and stumbling back into the house. I slammed the door behind me, leaning against the cool wood, my body shaking with anger and grief. How could they do this to me? How could my own daughter, my own flesh and blood, betray me like this? I stumbled through the living room, my eyes falling on a framed photograph of my late husband. His kind eyes seemed to look at me with understanding, with strength. A surge of resolve washed over me. I wouldn't let them win. I wouldn't let them take away everything I held dear. I walked over to the fireplace mantel, my fingers tracing the intricate carvings. Beneath the mantel, Hidden behind a loose brick was a small, unassuming box. Inside lay the documents, the ones they didn't know about, the ones that would change everything. My husband, always the pragmatist, had insisted on setting up an occupancy trust, just in case. He'd always said, "Hope for the best, Veralda, but prepare for the worst." And in this moment, his foresight felt like a lifeline. I clutched the box to my chest, a flicker of hope igniting within me. The storm outside raged on, but the storm inside me began to subside, replaced by a steely determination. I would fight back. I would reclaim what was rightfully mine, and Miss and Galenthi would learn that some betrayals come at a very steep price. The real toll would be riding soon. Let them come. I would be ready. Rain lashed against the windows, mirroring the storm brewing inside my home. I placed a manila envelope on the coffee table, its weight a small comfort against the heavy silence in the room. Roth, Mrs. Father, cleared his throat, the sound grating on my raw nerves. "Now, Veralda," he began, his voice oily and condescending. "I'm sure we can handle this like reasonable adults. You know Miss and Galen need a bigger place, and this house," I interrupted, my voice steadier than I felt, "is mine." Celine, Roth's wife, and Mrs. Mother scoffed. "Oh, really? And what makes you so sure?" My fingers traced the edge of the envelope. "I'm quite sure, Celine." I slid the documents out, spreading them across the table. "These, as you can see, are the legally binding papers of an occupancy trust established by my late husband before his passing." Roth leaned forward, his eyes scanning the pages, his face slowly draining of color. Celine peered over his shoulder, her mouth forming a silent O of disbelief. "An occupancy trust," Roth stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. We weren't aware of any such thing." "Of course you weren't," I replied, a flicker of a smile playing on my lips. "This trust grants me, Veralda, exclusive rights to occupy this property for the duration of my lifetime. It supersedes any will or inheritance claims." I met their gazes, each word a hammer blow against their carefully constructed plan. In simpler terms, I continued, allowing myself a small, satisfied sigh. "This house is mine, and neither Miss Galen nor the two of you have any claim to it whatsoever." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken accusations, with the shattered remnants of their greed. Roth finally broke it, his voice a mixture of disbelief and anger. But your husband, he always implied." "Implied what, Roth?" I asked, my voice sharp. "That he would leave everything to his darling daughter and her charming husband. He implied a great many things, but he ensured in writing that I would be taken care of." I watched as they absorbed the truth, the reality of their failed scheme sinking in. The rain continued to batter the windows, a fitting soundtrack to their crumbling hopes. Celine's face was contorted in a mask of fury. "This is outrageous. We'll contest this," she sputtered, her voice trembling. I calmly folded the documents, tucking them back into the envelope. "Be my guest," I replied, my voice laced with a newfound confidence. "But I assure you, this trust is ironclad. My husband was meticulous in his planning, and these documents are indisputable." Roth, his face ashen, reached for his phone. "I need to speak to Galen," he muttered, his voice tight with suppressed rage. I watched them, feeling a strange sense of detachment, as though observing a play unfold. They had come to my home, expecting to claim it as their own, to displace me, to disregard my grief and my rights. They had underestimated me, dismissed me as a grieving widow too distraught to defend what was rightfully hers. They had made a grave miscalculation. The look on their faces, a mixture of shock, anger, and dawning realization, was a balm to the wounds they had inflicted. It was a small victory, perhaps, but a significant one. The house was mine, and I had won the first battle. But the war, I knew, was far from over. I had protected my home, but the betrayal of my own daughter, the callous disregard for my feelings, those wounds ran deep, and as I watched Roth and Celine scramble to salvage their failed plan, I knew with a chilling certainty that this was just the beginning. I needed to know what Miss knew, what she had agreed to. The confrontation with her, I realized, was inevitable, and I would be ready. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across my living room floor, the same floor my husband and I had chosen together, the same floor Miss had learned to walk on. Now, those shadows stretched over empty spaces where Roth and Celine's belongings had been just hours before. The removal men worked efficiently, their faces impassive, as they carried out the gaudy armchair Celine had insisted on placing by the fireplace. The oversized television Roth had declared essential. Even the hideous ceramic frog collection Celine claimed brought her good luck. Careful with that, I called out, my voice sharper than I intended, when one of the movers bumped the frog collection against the doorframe. He grunted in acknowledgement, not even bothering to look my way. I watched as the last of their possessions were loaded onto the truck, a strange mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion settling in my bones. It was over. For now, I'd given them an hour. 1 hour to pack their things and leave. You have 60 minutes, I'd told them, my voice shaking only slightly, to remove yourselves and your belongings from my property. Roth had spluttered, his face turning an alarming shade of purple. Your property, he choked out. This house belongs to Miss now, and by extension, to us. We're her family. Celine, ever the picture of composure, or at least her version of it, simply glared at me, her lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line. You should be ashamed of yourself, Veralda, she'd hissed, treating your own daughter like this. After all we've done for her, all you've done, I'd asked, my voice rising. You've manipulated my daughter, taken advantage of my grief, and tried to steal my home. Don't you dare talk about what you've done for Miss. I pointed towards the door. The clock is ticking. They'd blustered and protested, threatening legal action, promising repercussions. But they'd left. They knew deep down they had no legal leg to stand on. They hadn't accounted for David's foresight, for the quiet, unassuming occupancy trust he'd established years ago, just in case, he'd said, just in case of something like this. Now, standing in the relative quiet of my reclaimed home, I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me. I sank onto the sofa, the one David and I had picked out on our 10th anniversary, and closed my eyes. The past few days had been a whirlwind of emotions, shock, betrayal, anger, and now, finally, a fragile sense of victory. But beneath it all, A deep sadness lingered. Miss hadn't called, hadn't even attempted to contact me. Had she known what her parents were planning? Had she been complicit in their scheme? The thought twisted in my gut, a painful knot of uncertainty and disappointment. I opened my eyes and looked around the room. It felt empty, not because of Roth and Celine's absence, but because of Mrs. I picked up a framed photo from the side table, a picture of Miss and me at her graduation. She was beaming, her arm round my shoulder, her eyes full of hope and promise. Where had that girl gone? The girl who used to bake cookies with me on Sunday afternoons, the girl who confided in me about her dreams and fears, the girl who called me Mom instead of the cold, formal Veralda she'd used lately. The front door opened, and the last of the movers stepped out. "All clear, Mum," he said, touching the brim of his cap. I thanked him and watched as the truck rumbled down the driveway, disappearing around the bend. The silence that descended afterward was heavy, broken only by the chirping of crickets in the evening air. I went to the window and looked out at the garden, at the roses David had planted for me on our first anniversary. They were in full bloom, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the grayness that had settled over my heart. I knew this wasn't over. This was just the beginning. I had won this battle, but the war, the fight for my daughter, was far from won. I had protected my home, my sanctuary, but the real prize, the one I truly longed for, was Miss, and I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I would do whatever it took to get her back. I just didn't know how yet, but I would figure it out. I had to, for David, for Miss, and for myself. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of wine, and raised it in a silent toast to the future, whatever it may hold. The evening air hung heavy with the scent of honeysuckle, a cruel reminder of happier birthdays past. I heard a car pull up the drive, the crunch of gravel under its tires a familiar sound. It wasn't Mrs. Carr. Cautiously, I peered through the curtains and saw Galen step out, looking bewildered. He glanced up at the house, then back towards the street as if expecting someone else to appear. "Galen," I called out from the porch, my voice steadier than I expected. He jumped slightly, then walked towards the house, his face etched with confusion. "Veralda, what's going on? Miss isn't answering her phone. Her parents aren't either." I gestured for him to come up onto the porch. "Come in, Galen. I think we need to talk." He followed me inside, his eyes scanning the familiar living room, lingering on the family photos still adorning the mantelpiece. He sat on the edge of the sofa, his posture stiff. "Where is everyone?" he asked again, his voice tight with worry. "I'm afraid I have some rather unsettling news, Galen," I began, pouring him a glass of iced tea. He accepted it with a hesitant nod, his gaze fixed on me. "You see, this house seat's still mine." His eyebrows shot up in surprise. "But I thought Miss said," he trailed off, clearly struggling to reconcile what he thought he knew with what I was telling him. "Miss said a lot of things, Galen, things that weren't entirely true." I took a deep breath and explained about the occupancy trust my late husband had established years ago, a safeguard we'd put in place just in case, a safeguard I'd almost forgotten about myself until Miss and her parents made their intentions so painfully clear. I explained how the trust stipulated that I retain the right to live in the house until my death, a condition they had conveniently overlooked in their haste to claim it. Galen listened intently, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief, then to a dawning realization. He set the iced tea down on the coffee table, untouched. "So they knew all along that you had the right to stay here?" His voice was barely a whisper. "Yes, Galen," I said softly, meeting his gaze. "They knew." I watched as the pieces clicked into place for him, the realization of his wife's deception washing over him. He ran a hand through his hair, a look of utter bewilderment on his face. "But he murmured, more to himself than to me. "Why would they do this? I wish I knew, Galen." I replied honestly. "I truly wish I knew." I told him about their visit, the blatant disregard for my feelings, the cold, calculating way they had tried to force me out of my own home. He listened, his face pale, his eyes filled with a mixture of hurt and anger. He looked around the living room again, as if seeing it with new eyes. This is unbelievable," he stammered. "I can't believe they would do this to you, to us." "Us?" I questioned, raising an eyebrow. He looked at me, a pained expression on his face. "To feel like I've been complicit in this, Veralda. Even though I didn't know, I should have questioned things more. I should have talked to you." He stood up and paced the room, agitation evident in his every movement. "I need to talk to Miss," he said, his voice strained. "I need to understand why." "I understand, Galen," I said quietly. "But before you go, I want you to know something. This wasn't about revenge. It was about protecting what's mine. This house, these memories are all I have left of my husband, and I wasn't going to let anyone take them away from me." He stopped pacing and looked at me, a flicker of respect in his eyes. "I understand," he said, his voice regaining some of its strength. "I'll talk to Miss, and I'll talk to her parents too." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Thank you, Veralda," he said, his voice low, "for telling me the truth." Then he was gone, leaving me alone in the quiet house, the scent of honeysuckle suddenly not so cloying anymore. A small smile played on my lips, the first genuine smile I'd felt in days. I had won, but the fight, I knew, was far from over. The evening air hung heavy, the silence in my home almost unbearable after the whirlwind of the day. Galen sat across from me, a grin set to his jaw, his eyes avoiding mine. He hadn't spoken a word since the movers, hired by his parents, had retreated with their tails between their legs, their truck loaded with the belongings they'd prematurely declared their own. Earlier, when his parents, Roth and Celine, had arrived on my doorstep, practically salivating at the thought of taking possession, the sheer audacity of it all had left me momentarily speechless. They'd actually produced keys, cut without my knowledge or consent. "We're here to finalize the move," Roth had announced, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "We know this is a difficult time for you, Veralda, but we're here to help." Help themselves, more like. Celine, ever the picture of icy composure, had simply smiled thinly and added, "We'll take good care of the house, dear." They hadn't even waited for an invitation before barging in, their eyes already scanning the furnishings, calculating their worth. But then, the sheriff had arrived, followed shortly by my lawyer, a smug smile playing on his lips. Now, with Galen finally alone with me, I slid the trust document across the polished mahogany table. the same table my late husband, Harold, had lovingly restored years ago. It seems you weren't aware of Harold's foresight, I said quietly, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. He picked up the document, his fingers tracing the embossed heading, the Herald and Veralda Occupancy Trust. He read through it slowly, his face paling with each line. I didn't know, he stammered, finally meeting my gaze. Miss didn't tell me. There it was, the predictable deflection. He always deferred to Miss, letting her lead, even when her path was clearly treacherous. The house, I explained, remains mine, and mine alone, as long as I reside within its walls. Upon my death, it passes to Miss, but not a moment before I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in. Your parents' enthusiasm was misplaced. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. They assumed. I finished for him that I was a grieving widow, easily manipulated, easily dismissed. They thought they could waltz in here and claim what was rightfully mine. He looked down at the document again, rereading the clauses meticulously crafted by Harold years ago, a safeguard against the very scenario that had just unfolded. Harold, bless his heart, had always been one step ahead. He'd anticipated the vultures that might circle, especially after Mrs. behavior on my birthday, her blatant disregard for me, for our family history. She hadn't even bothered to call, let alone visit. Instead, she'd sent a curt text, claiming a prior engagement, an engagement that, I later discovered, involved celebrating with Galen's parents, planning their takeover of my home. The sting of that betrayal, of being discarded so casually, was still raw. I never wanted this, Galen murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. He looked genuinely distressed, his usual confident demeanor shattered. Then why didn't you stop them? I asked, my voice hardening. Why didn't you question, Miss? Why didn't you stand up for me? For your family? He flinched at my words, but remained silent. He had no answer. He had allowed himself to be swept along by his wife's ambition, by his parents' greed. He had chosen their side over mine. I've always treated you like a son, Galen, I said, my voice softening slightly. I welcomed you into my family, into my home, and this is how you repay me. He finally looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and regret. I'm sorry, Veralda, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I truly am. But sorry wasn't enough. Sorry couldn't erase the hurt, the betrayal, the blatant disrespect. Sorry couldn't undo the damage that had been done. The trust had protected my home, yes, but it hadn't protected my heart. That, I feared, would take much longer to heal. You should go, Galen, I said warily, rising from my chair. Go and talk to your wife. Ask her why she felt the need to deceive me, to steal from me. Ask her why she chose greed over family. He nodded silently, his face etched with a newfound understanding, a dawning realization of the depth of his wife's betrayal. He rose as well, his shoulders slumped, his footsteps heavy as he walked towards the door. He paused at the threshold, turning back to me, a flicker of something akin to fear in his eyes. What will you do now, Veralda? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. I met his gaze, a small, sad smile playing on my lips. I'll rebuild, I said quietly. I'll reclaim what was lost, and I'll never forget this lesson." He nodded again, then turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the quiet stillness of my home. The house that was still mine, the house I had fought to protect, the house that held so many memories, both sweet and bitter. The fight for my home was over, but the fight for my family, for my daughter's love and respect, that fight was just beginning. The chill night air seeped through the open doorway, carrying with it the echoes of Roth and Celine's stunned silence. They stood on my porch, mouths agape, clutching their pathetic little suitcases. "I believe you have something of mine," I said, my voice calm despite the turmoil inside. Celine finally found her voice, stuttering. But the lawyer, the paperwork." I held up the occupancy trust document, its official seal gleaming in the porch light. "This," I stated, "supersedes any claim you thought you had." Roth's face reddened. "This is outrageous. We'll be taking this further," he blustered. "Be my guest," I replied, meeting his gaze unflinchingly. "I have nothing to hide." The silence stretched, thick with their disbelief and simmering resentment. It was Galen who finally broke it. He had been standing back, a silent observer to the unfolding drama. His face was pale, his eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and hurt. Miss told me," he stammered, his voice trailing off. "Told you what, Galen?" I asked gently, watching his face crumble. He looked from me to his parents, then back to the house, as though seeing it for the first time. She said this was rightfully hers, that you didn't want it." He sounded like a child caught in a lie, his voice small and uncertain. "And did she tell you why I wouldn't want my own home?" I pressed, my voice laced with a quiet steel. He shook his head miserably. "She just said it was complicated, that it brought back to many memories." I let out a small, humorless laugh. "Memories, yes, it's full of them. Happy memories, mostly. Memories of my husband, of Miss growing up within these walls." I looked directly at Galen. "Did she ever mention those memories to you?" He avoided my gaze, his silence a deafening confirmation. I sighed. "The fight draining out of me, Galen," I said softly. "I loved my husband very much. This house was our dream, and no one, not even my own daughter, is going to take that away from me." I gestured towards their luggage. "I suggest you take your belongings and leave. I don't want to see any of you here again." Roth puffed up again, ready to launch another tirade. But Celine tugged at his arm. "Come on, Roth," she hissed, her voice sharp. "Let's just go." She shot me a venomous look before turning and marching down the driveway, her heels clicking angrily against the pavement. Roth hesitated, opened his mouth as if to speak, then thought better of it and followed his wife, muttering under his breath. Galen remained, rooted to the spot. He looked lost, his shoulders slumped, his face etched with a deep sadness. "I don't understand," he whispered, more to himself than to me. "I thought," she said. He shook his head again, as if trying to clear his thoughts. "She said you were unstable, that you couldn't cope with the house anymore, that it would be better if we took care of it." I looked at him, a wave of pity washing over me. He had been manipulated, used as a pawn in Mrs. Cruel game. He truly hadn't known. "Galen," I said, my voice weary, "you need to talk to Miss. You need to ask her why she lied to you." why she tried to steal my home. I paused, letting the words sink in. And you need to ask yourself why you believed her without question. He flinched at my words, his eyes filled with a dawning realization. He looked at me, a flicker of anger now visible in his expression. I will, he said, his voice low and determined. I'll get to the bottom of this. He turned and walked away, his steps quicker now, purposeful. He didn't look back. As I watched him go, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief that my home was safe, sadness for the fractured relationship with my daughter, and a sliver of satisfaction, knowing that the truth was finally out in the open. Galen's departure left a heavy silence in its wake, a silence that spoke volumes about the damage Miss had wrought. I closed the door, shutting out the chill night air and the lingering echoes of their deceit. The house was quiet now, but I knew the storm wasn't over. It had merely shifted, gathering force elsewhere, and I knew, with a chilling certainty, that Miss would soon face the consequences of her actions. The confrontation was coming, and I wouldn't be there to shield her from the fallout.